Hello everyone, and welcome to part 5 of this video series. In this part, we'll focus on building a really nice looking chart for historical stock data. We'll also build these chart filter components, which will later be used to filter the data by day, by week, by month, or by year. The data for the chart will come from the Finnhub API, in particular the stock candles endpoint. This endpoint returns the list of low prices, the list of high prices, and the list of close prices for a stock. The actual specifics of these aren't really that important, so for the scope of this video, we'll focus on the list of close prices. Recharts also provides some very good documentation, so if you ever feel like you get stuck during this video, you can also refer to this documentation. I'll leave a link in the description. We left off with creating the header, the overview, the details, and the theme icon component. Before we head on further, I'll simply change the background to give it some more contrast. Head over to the dashboard.js, and for the div class name, we'll simply apply a background of neutral 100. Let's see how this looks. Perfect, this has more contrast. Now let's continue making this chart. I'll start by making some helper functions that will help us with the formatting of the data. Under source, make a new folder. We'll call this helpers, and then make a new file called datehelper. The first function I'll make is called convert date to Unix timestamp. And this will take a date as an argument. And we'll return math.floor of date.getTime over 1000. The reason we need this is because later on with the Finnhub API, we'll need to pass in a Unix timestamp. And the difference between the date.getTime and a Unix timestamp is that this method returns milliseconds. However, the Finnhub API uses a Unix timestamp, which is in seconds. So we'll need to convert from milliseconds to seconds. Let's also make a function called convert Unix timestamp to date. And this will just be the opposite of this. As an argument, it'll take a Unix timestamp. So milliseconds will be Unix timestamp times 1000. And then we'll return a new date with this milliseconds as an argument to locale date string. And this method will be used for helping us format some of the data when we're actually displaying it to the user. Lastly, we'll create another function called createDate. And as arguments, it'll take a start date, then it'll take days, weeks, months, and years. So what this method will do is it'll have a start date, and then depending on if we pass in 1 day, 2 days, 1 week, whatever it may be, months or years, it'll add that to that date. So this will help us create a start date and end date, which will pass to the Finnhub API. So we'll create a new date. and then we'll add our days, our weeks, our months, and our years, whatever's passed into this method. So we'll add the days along with 7 times weeks. And this method will also work with negative values. So if we pass in -1 days or -1 years, it'll create a new date in the past. So if we look at the stock handles endpoint in greater detail, we'll see that the required arguments are the from and to arguments. And here it describes a Unix timestamp. So this is why those methods are important. We'll see that later on as well. We're now all set up to make the chart component. Let's go ahead and do that. Let's start by creating some state. So for the data that we'll use for the chart, we'll use our mock historical data for now. Next, we'll also have a filter. We'll set this to 1 week for now. Now we'll also need to make a format data method. And the reason this is important is because we need to pass the data in a way that Recharts understands it. So let's return data.c, which is a list of closed prices as we discussed earlier. We can take a look at the mock.js just to have a reminder. If we look at mock historical data, C is basically an array of numbers. What we'll try to do is map this and create an array of objects, and in each object we'll have a value and a date. So data.c.map, and we'll pass in a method with an item and an index, and inside this we'll return an object. For the value, we'll pass in item dot toFixed of 2, so we'll have 2 decimal places. Next, for the date, we'll have convert Unix timestamp to date, and we'll pass in data.t of index. If we take a look back at our mock.js, T is an array of timestamps, in particular Unix timestamps. Now let's start populating the content. We'll replace this with a card. And inside here, we'll have a responsive container from Recharts. Inside here, we'll have an AreaChart. We'll pass in our data. And remember to call this format data method. Now inside the AreaChart, we'll have an actual area component. For type, we'll give this monotone. For data key, this will be value, because remember we're passing in an array of objects and each object has a value and a date. Our data key is actually the value. For stroke, we'll give this a color of purple. Fill opacity, I'll give this 1. And a stroke width of 0.5. Next, we'll create a tooltip. We'll also have an x-axis. For the data key, this will be date. We'll also have a y-axis. We'll set this to data min and data max. So the y-axis is only comprised of the minimum value and the maximum value and everything in between. For some reason, the area component wasn't automatically imported, so I'll add that in now. Now let's head over to our dashboard. Let's replace this card with our actual chart component. And we can also get rid of this unused import up here. Let's see how the chart looks. This is good. We have a chart with 3 data points. If you can hover your tooltip above it, you'll notice that there's 3 data points. We'll fix a few things with this. In particular, the color isn't that nice. So we'll replace this with a linear gradient. And later on, we'll have more data points when it comes directly from the Finnhub API. Recharts actually has an example that uses a linear gradient. So we'll follow this example. And let's copy paste this linear gradient here. And now we can paste it inside our area chart. I'll change a few things here. For the ID, I'll give this chart color. And for the stop color, I'll change this as well. I'll pass in an RGB value with a purple type of color. And I'll copy paste this here. And here as well. We only need one linear gradient, so I'll remove the second one over here. Now, in our area, we'll apply a fill. And we'll pass it the ID of chart color. Let's see if this worked. Perfect. This looks much nicer. Let's continue with our ChartFilter components. So for each ChartFilter, I'll return a button. For props, I'll pass in text active, so if it's active or not, and an onClick. So inside that button, we'll render that text. We'll pass in the onClick. And we can apply some styling. For the class name, I'll pass in a template literal. I'll give this W12 M2 for some margin, height of 8, border 1, rounded, then we'll center the text in the middle, so flex, item center, justify center, we'll also add a cursor pointer. Now we'll add a bit of JavaScript. If it's active, we'll have the style a bit different. In particular, if it's active, we'll return a background of indigo 600. Along with a border of indigo 700. And text gray 100. However, if it's not active, we'll pass in border indigo 300 and text indigo 300. So now that we've created this component, let's use them inside our chart. Inside our card, we'll return an unordered list. For this unordered list, I'll give it a class name of flex and absolute position, so we'll put it at the top right. So top 2 and right 2. Also apply Z40 so it has some elevation. Inside here, we'll map through the keys of our chart config. Let's just go back to our chart config as a reminder. So here we have an object and our keys are the chart filters that we want. So we made 1 day, 1 week, 1 month, and 1 year. So we'll map through all these keys. So object.keys of chart config dot map and for each item again we'll have a list item. And inside each list item, we'll have the chart filter component that we created. Let's pass in the props. So for the text, that'll be equal to the item. Basically, it'll be either 1 day, 1 week, 1 month, or 1 year. Next, for active, we'll pass in if filter is equal to item. Remember, we created a state up here for the filter, and we initialized it to 1 week. If we scroll back down, the only thing we're missing is the onClick. So we'll pass in a function, and all this will do is set the filter to the item. Let's make sure to return this list item. And let's see how this looks. So, as we see in the chart component, we have our chart filters in the top right. If we take a closer look, When we click on one of these chart filters, it updates the state and the style accordingly. So, as you can see, our app has come along quite nicely. In the next video, we'll take a look at implementing a dark theme. I hope you enjoyed the content, and I'll see you in the next video.